Hey, hi.
You have something.
Good afternoon. I'm introducing you today, and I want to make sure I say your name correctly. Is it Dr. Preeti Malani?
Yep, it's like a TH sound. Creepy.
Preeti, got it.
Thank
All
you.
right, perfect.
And
So-
I'm hoping to, and again, I'll give all the slides to all of you. I actually had like a conflict at the same time, and I'm hoping to finish up just a few minutes early. I'll
Sounds
move
good.
fast, and if there are questions, we can always, I'll do my best.
No, we understand, and I really appreciate you being
Yeah,
willing to
thank you.
come because I know you're busy, and I think no one ever minds getting a couple minutes back in there.
Yeah, no problem.
I did just want to say, Dr. Malani, Dr. Afodakan called a little while ago and did not realize he had a call scheduled with the NIH at the same time, and he
No
just
problem.
send his regrets.
He's going to be bummed because this is a seriously amazing talk. I'm excited.
He's heard it a few times, but yes.
I learn something every time. It's amazing.
Yeah, no problem. And I have whenever, do you want me to share my screen now?
Sure, we can do that.
Okay, let's see.
And Felicia, I guess we've got a quorum. We could go ahead and have you do the introduction.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Preeti Malani. She's a professor of medicine in the Division of Infectious Diseases. She's here today to give us an awesome talk about scientific communication that she's very qualified for as a deputy editor and editorial director for equity at JAMA and the JAMA Network. So this is really cool. She also has a very interesting background. She had a pretty major role in the pandemic in her state as part of the COVID-19 nursing home task force. She has served on the National Institutes of Health Data Safety Monitoring Board for Operation Warp Speed, and she's a member of a research team that oversees the National Poll on Healthy Aging, because not only she's an infectious disease physician, but she's also received training in geriatrics. She also, interestingly enough, has a degree in journalism, so I think that this will make this talk even extra special. So thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Malani.
Thank you, Felicia. And it's a pleasure to be here and to be with all of you. And I'm really excited to chat a bit about papers. And I'm going to give you all these slides, so don't feel like you have to take notes. I think just, kind of take it in, and, hopefully it'll give you some structure in terms of how to write papers. And, writing a paper is kind of like learning to drive a car. If you remember doing that, or if you, like me, I have young adult children who thankfully are really excellent drivers now, but I remember when they learned to drive. The point is you have to drive. You can't read about it. And so with that, I'm going to just go ahead and launch in. Let's see. And I don't have any other disclosures other than being a deputy editor at JAMA. So, just for starters, I think what I like people to think about is that it takes a lot of work to design a paper, design a study, and go through all the data collection and analysis. And then the problem is a lot of times this just gets left as an abstract and it doesn't get written. And I think that is it's not good. It's not good for funding. It's not good for your career, but it's also, just it prevents us from getting information out to the scientific community. And so I would just say, if you submit abstracts and then you don't get the paper written, you're missing an opportunity. And, hopefully I can try to fill in some of the gaps around writing to sort of help make sure that doesn't happen. Writing, I mentioned, it's a little bit like driving a car. It gets learned. It gets easier with time and with practice. One thing I would recommend is to keep track of papers that you read that are really well written, and sort of tuck them aside in your virtual library. If you're a good reader, you become a good writer. Construct an outline the way you might as if you were giving a talk, and then also think about who's around you for candid feedback. And one of the things I think is probably underused is the idea of a writing club. The idea of sort of workshopping some of this, and the intro or the methods or whatever it is, but getting together on a regular basis with colleagues, potentially those who share your interests and potentially those who don't, but just to keep yourself on track. Research skills are also critical. And I know many of you are involved in formal master's programs, or you've, obtained a master's program. And so I think having some of those core elements around epidemiology, biostats are really important. And if you don't have them, having someone on your team who does. Also, keeping Google alerts or other alerts, so you keep up with the literature, because things are moving really fast, and especially in infectious disease. All of you are aware the human subjects requires IRB approval, and that clinical trials, and I know some of you are involved in clinical trials, these have to be registered prospectively. And in fact, people are registering other kinds of studies prospectively these days too. Title page, the basic function of this title is just to provide a description of your work. Longer is not better. I have seen everything from question marks to exclamation points, but you just kind of just state it. You don't need a punctuation. Authorship is something that is a little bit awkward to talk about, and I think it's important to get that sorted out. And if you are earlier in your career, having someone who perhaps is in a more of a mentorship role or sponsorship role with you to help you get through that, because not everyone is an author on things, and sometimes there's a limit on the number of people that can be authors. And this is really important to get that sorted out ahead of time. I mentioned here, usually in papers, if you look closely, there's a guarantor. Dr. Smith and Dr. Jones take responsibility for the integrity of this work, and it's usually one author, and usually someone who deals with the methods statistician or someone else. But just so you know that is there, and sometimes you'll be asked to provide that. Abstract. And the abstract is probably one of the most underappreciated elements, and sometimes it gets rushed at the end, but it's really very, very important. And most people are only going to read your abstract. So taking time, making sure everything in the abstract is in the paper. One tip is that the introduction can be really brief in an abstract, a sentence or two. One mistake people do is they put too much in the intro and they don't emphasize results, but you do want to put in as much data as possible. Watch for uncommon abbreviations, and have an outside reader look at this and make sure that the importance of the work is really clear to a non-expert. And as I mentioned, people rush this at the end, myself included, and that's just a missed opportunity. And from a standpoint of publication, this is what an editor is going to look at. They're going to look at your abstract and make a decision on whether or not to send your paper out for review. The introduction is, I think a good introduction is really a thing of beauty. And of course, at JAMA, at New England Journal, other journals, if you read those intros, you'll see they're not exhaustive. They are 2 or 3 paragraphs long. And first paragraph, background. What is the problem? What's the issue? Second paragraph, importance of the problem, maybe some of the unresolved issues. And then if there's a third paragraph, the rationale for the current study, what is your study question, and maybe what is your hypothesis, depending. But if you really break it down to those 3 things, you should be able to write the intro pretty easily. I think the mistake people make is they want to be encyclopedic and they want to like write something that is exhaustive, like as if it's a book chapter or something, and it really needs to be pithy. But start reading intros, even for papers that are not of your, direct clinical interest, and you'll see what I mean by this. Like a well-written intro is just a beautiful thing. Methods, again, for the kind of work a lot of you are doing, it's going to be human subjects, IRB approval, type of consent, what type of statistics you did, interventions. It may be useful to have a diagram or timeline. Data analysis are really important, how the data were handled, statistical tests, power calculations. One thing that gets missed a lot, ironically, is missing data and the approach to missing data. And again, I think that gets missed even earlier on, and it's often not in the protocols. Last week, JAMA published a really important study on CMV and letermovir versus valganciclovir in high-risk recipients of kidney transplant. And, that was one where the missing data section was not done very detailed. And so we made the authors do all this extra stuff, something called a tipping point analysis. And it's in the supplemental work, but, it's an example of when you don't fill that out ahead of time, you end up maybe having to do a lot of work later. So, and again, it just depends on the journal, how much people are going to care, but pay attention to that. The other piece that we care a lot about at JAMA is how race and ethnicity was obtained, how that information was obtained. And self-report is going to be more accurate than investigators kind of looked at somebody and decided what they were. Again, the reasons why are also important. So that's something that you'll see pretty regularly in JAMA articles. Results. So one of the common mistakes here is that people, they try to bring opinion and discussion into the results, but it's really objective results, present them in a logical sequence. And again, I think some of the mistakes are also in the primary and secondary outcomes. And I've seen everything, from like presenting a exploratory, ad hoc kind of secondary outcome as a positive study. And, again, at the top tier general medical journals, they're going to really focus on that primary outcome. And, you can say the primary outcome was negative, and then, these secondary outcomes were sort of interest, but you have to really follow your protocol that you laid out. Something that we've seen in some of the adaptive trials, and I know some of you have been involved with these during COVID, the adaptive trials became so important in infectious disease, that there's something called like, gatekeeper function, where if the primary outcome isn't positive, you don't even look at the secondary outcomes. And, one of the studies that we were looking at, the secondary outcome ended up being positive, and it turned out it was a mortality outcome. And then how do you deal with that? Because you said in your protocol, you wouldn't look at that. You wouldn't make a comparison, but it's mortality. So it's very, very important. And so, there are all these nuances here, but paying a lot of attention to, first of all, what your primary outcome is, and then whether it was positive or not. Tables and figures, I don't want to say too much here, except I will add that at JAMA, we have 2 physician editors who deal with tables and figures, and other journals do not have those kind of resources. But again, NEJM, JAMA, Annals, Lancet, like the top tier general medical journals, take a look at the tables and figures and how data are displayed, and think about like how you could apply it to something that you're writing, because there's so much thought that goes into the data displays. And other journals, they simply just don't have that kind of expertise or that kind of resource. And so, learn from just like the intro, look at the tables and figures. Also, all the clinical trials will need a consort diagram. That's a flow chart that tells you, who you started with, who you ended with, and what happened to them. Sometimes treatment protocols can be really well described using a flow chart. And what I would say is complete, but not too complex. You don't need to use all these fancy fonts and, like a million colors, unless it improves readability. Discussion is the hardest part to write. That's where I get tripped up. It's where, intro is pretty easy. Methods is kind of formulaic. Results, you sort of get those done. But discussion is also where the magic happens. And this is a paradigm from a paper that's now almost 20 years old. But I think this really has continued to work. This idea of describe the key findings, concise summary, don't rewrite the whole results section, interpret the findings. This is where you get to interpret. You get to add in your, subjective thoughts and compare the results with the existing literature. What supports this, what doesn't support it. Think about the relevant literature. This is where a lot of your references for the paper might live, including that conflicts with your results. And then limitations. This is really important. And again, in JAMA, we always ask for a limitations section. Every work, the best study ever, is going to still have some limitations. Generalizability is an important one. And then if you get a chance, propose additional research. And then that can be what you ask for money for next, what are the next steps? Some things to avoid are too much representation of the results. I mentioned that. Causal language. And, this is changing, this idea of causal language, particularly for health services research. And I would just say to stay tuned. For a long time, only clinical trials were really allowed to use that kind of causal language. But I think the world is changing right now, real time with this, and you will see much more flexibility in the future around certain types of propensity matching. And, there's certain things you can't do a randomized trial in. Policy work, you can't really do randomized trials. So there'll be places where you'll see more causal language. People have actually said that in the policy world, this is tough because policymakers don't really understand association with. And so you'll see more flexibility with this moving forward, is my suspicion. One of the things to also pay attention to is unwarranted speculation. And I think all of you know what I'm talking about when you read something that's overly speculative. Overstating the importance of the findings. People do this a lot. Let's say this is the biggest study ever done. It's like the best study. It's the first. You could say the first to our knowledge, the largest to our knowledge. And then most importantly, something that will really produce a lot of difficulties is conclusions that are not supported by the data. So I think being very, very careful to make sure that that your data are informing your conclusions. So what do I write? Different approaches fit different research questions. And I think, thinking about what's feasible, collective reviews are nice. They help frame you as an expert in a particular area. And they can help you if you're writing a grant, like just to really get that intro section and really understand what's out there. So if there's an opportunity to do that, that's certainly time well spent for people. Otherwise, this is sort of my continuum, I would say here. The letter to the editor, research letters, then, brief report, concise communication, which is, maybe about 1,000 words, 1,200 words. Original articles, more like 3,000, 4,000 words. Retrospective is easier to do, but prospective is going to be more impactful. And then some of the places that some of you are living, the idea of interventional trials. This requires money, time, a whole infrastructure, often multi-centers. And then systematic reviews and meta-analysis. And infectious disease has seen a lot of really great work come out in these spaces. It's its own technique. I'm not an expert in those, but there may be some topics that really lend themselves well to systematic reviews and meta-analyses. So people often ask where they should send their work. I think being aware of publishing priorities at different journals, really important to have an appropriate journal. Be familiar with the scope and the type of articles published, and look over the journal before sending your paper. If it's basic science, it's probably not going to go to a journal that's very clinical, and vice versa, for example. And one of the questions that comes up is it worth shooting high and failing? And I think one question to think about is how time sensitive are the results? And in infectious disease, there's been a lot of time sensitivity the last few years. And if you send your paper, your article to a journal and it sits there for 4 or 5 months, that can really hurt you. And so, I think getting to the right journal, but I do think it is worth trying to reach, particularly when it's impactful work. It's a trial. It's something that's going to change clinical practice. Talk to your colleagues and your collaborators and people in your life who are knowledgeable about where to send your work. Think about the audience you're trying to reach. Professional society journals are really important. And within infectious disease, we have a number of really outstanding journals. One thing I mentioned is there are some journals that are peer reviewed, but they're not indexed. And this can be a good place for reviews. There are some open access journals. Now we'll talk for a minute about predatory journals, and that's different. So you have to be very careful. Sometimes you'll end up things that look too good to be true probably are. I want to touch on impact factor just for a moment. And again, I'll give you these slides. The 2021 impact factor, which is the ones we have right now, and they're like off the charts. The 2022 impact factors are going to be out later this month. But with COVID, they're articles that have had like 100,000 citations, just sort of off the charts. And I think, again, we'll see those numbers come down. Everything's been inflated the last few years, but it's basically just a ratio of citations to papers during a year of papers that were published the prior 2 years. So things that published in 2019 and 2020, how many times were they cited in 2021? And then again, 2022 will be 2020 and 2021. So high impact journals, what are they interested in? Novelty, clinical importance, validity, generalizability. We're really looking at JAMA for an effect on clinical care or population health, which means large randomized clinical trials, ideally multi-center, ideally positive, but not always. Negative trials are really important too. Large observational studies, you will see those. And right now, some of the, one we had a few weeks ago was on COVID, sort of post-acute symptoms. And again, that's not a randomized trial, but really, really important work. With a rare condition or disease, we want to see a large effect. With something that's more common, small effect, something incremental could be important. So think heart disease, diabetes, versus, a genetic condition, for example, that's rare. And I will say quality reports, they just tend to not have priority at general medical journals. Not to say that they're not important. They are very important, but you're going to probably want to go to a more specialized journal for some of those. High impact journals are less interested in confirmatory studies without new insights, small slices of information, small single site randomized trials. Surveys are you're not going to see those that often. And if you do, they need to be really current and they need to have a high response rate. Anything that's more than 5 years old is unlikely to be published in a top tier journal. So one more reason to try and move your work forward. I saw something today where it was looking at nursing home and hospitalizations from 2018. And, and I rejected it without a review because in 2018, first of all, it's 5 years. Second of all, like the world has changed so much because of the pandemic. It's really hard to look at something from 2018 and apply it to today. So I think that is something that to keep in mind. Now, some conditions like Staph aureus bacteremia, it was the same in 2018 as it is today. But that is not the case for like hospital admissions, for example. Qualitative mixed methods, you don't see those as much, although I always love it if people can tuck it in there, a qualitative component. And then of course, results that are not generalizable, like they're at a place that's different, is going to be hard to get into high impact journal. I just want to show you this. I don't know if people are familiar with this journal author name estimator. You can go online. If you just type in Jane in all caps in Google, you'll find it. And, I just looked at stewardship here. And again, I'm just going to encourage you to play with this. You could put in keywords, you could put in an abstract, a title. It'll give you a bunch of journals, and then you can click on these links and see what type of work related to that topic has been published in some journals that you might be interested in publishing in. I want to say a word about predatory journals. This is like the best of us can be confused by this because it really is like the photo here, you know, like a wolf in sheep's clothing. These are journals that don't care about you. They care about their own self-interest, lack of transparency. They're aggressive. And, you know, usually if they say things like, you know, we'll review your paper in 2 days and publish it within a week, it's probably predatory. And there is a list called Beall's List. I don't think it is being kept up to date, but if it's a journal you've never heard of, do some homework before you send anything to them or talk to them, because it's a little bit like the telemarketers or like the scam artists. Like once you're sort of in their orbit, it's a little hard to get rid of them. Appearance counts. I think people are aware of this. You know, read the instructions for authors. Think about article type, word count, format, you know, what kind of reference style. You know, I saw something recently that said, you know, people are really wasting a lot of time formatting papers, and some journals don't care. They say, you know what, just send it to us as is and we'll deal with that. But I would say that if you are trying for a top tier journal, make sure that you format it correctly, because otherwise it looks like you're sending it after you sent it elsewhere. And that's just, you know, editors are people too. Their feelings might get hurt. So, you know, and the more important thing from my standpoint is that if there's sloppiness in the paper, I wonder if there's sloppiness in the research. And so being very careful, making sure that things are match up, the numbers add up, follow reporting guidelines. I'll where appropriate, I'll show you those. Spelling, editing, you know, these days on Microsoft Word, you can really do a lot of editing. You know, you can come up with ways to, you know, just even going through the spell check and the grammar check, just, you know, take the easy ones in your life. But I will say well-written, properly formatted papers are much more likely to be sent out for review. I already mentioned that the abstract is the single most important page. Pay attention. You know, I look at that first, and then data displays are also important. I mentioned this. I'll just let you play with this also. Equator Network. There are different guidelines. I think we think about randomized trials most commonly. The idea of the consort guidelines, you know, what you need, like there's a checklist. There are also checklists for systematic reviews, Prisma, observational studies, the Strobe, and there are actually hundreds of these, but I would say those are the 3 big ones. And if you are working on something, you know, follow these guidelines. It'll make your work better. And I think I am hearing authors say, we followed the Prisma guidelines, we followed the Strobe guidelines. And so I think that's just something to be aware about. Just a few things for clear writing: avoiding jargon, too many abbreviations, you know, too many pronouns. When possible, using active voice. It's not always possible with scientific writing. Language should be clear and it should be precise. When I read the sentence, I shouldn't be confused about what you're talking about. And again, this is where at a place like JAMA, where we only publish 200 research articles a year, you know, I will go through something line by line and make sure every word makes sense to me. Most journals don't have that kind of capacity, but you want your work to read well and to be clean in terms of the writing. Have a friend read the whole paper for you if your friend is willing, and maybe you can do that for your friend later. But this way you make sure that the importance is apparent to a non-expert. I talk a lot about themes with writing, and as you're putting your paper together, what are the 2 or 3 things that you want me to walk away with? And if you think about that, emphasize it in the abstract, in the text, in the papers, over and over and over. What are the 2 or 3 things that you want me to walk away with? Common mistakes. I mentioned authorship. You know, people will circulate a draft without having a list of authors. Try to have the authorship list out, you know, on the paper. People rush the abstract. They mess up the data on the abstract. They mess up numbers. Secondary rather than primary outcomes. I mentioned that already. Spelling errors, too much first person. Sometimes there's too many references or just not enough. At JAMA, we talk about 15 references in the intro and 40 references overall as a benchmark. We're less stringent about that now, but I don't think you need more than that. So, you know, if you have 100 references, it's too many. Other things, inconsistency in the results, like those are the kind of things that are, it just smacks of sloppiness. Lack of clarity, make sure language is precise. Too many messages and comparisons. Like I said, what are the 2 or 3 things you want me to understand? People exaggerate the findings. They don't have a clear, they don't really explain methods very well. Relative and absolute differences are important, right? You know, absolute differences might be really small, but it's easy to say, well, there was a 50% increase, but again, it might have gone from like 1 to 1.5% or something like that. So making sure you're paying attention, and absolute differences are really expected at most places, not the relative differences. The other thing people do is they misuse trend. They talk about, oh, there was a trend towards significance. You probably won't get away with that in a top tier journal. You might get away with it in a more specialized journal, but I don't know. I don't know what that means in terms of I'm sorry, I got distracted for a second. You know, what is that like? What does that mean? A trend toward significance? I think you can say that, you know, maybe we were underpowered, or, you know, there was something else there, but I think really talking about this in a thoughtful way in your discussion, you know, maybe if you had more people and what's happened is like the pandemic hit and we had to close our study. And so we're not really sure where we would have gone, but here are the data. We might have, you know, had a type 2 error. There's ways that you can talk about things without saying there was a trend towards significance. Okay. Just want to talk about peer review. You know, I think there's a lot of confusion around peer review. And I think for some of you who are, you know, early career, you're training, you know, getting opportunities to do this with your mentors and sponsors is really helpful. But the whole idea of peer review is that we ask reviewers who have the same kind of scholarly area to look at your paper. There's not a lot of science on this in terms of, you know, is it concealed in terms of the identity of the authors or not? And different journals are doing different things. Some journals are publishing the reviews online. They require you to share your name. But anyways, we rely on somebody else as an external expert to help give us an idea of the importance of work, and hence the term peer review. Just a little bit about the approach to revisions and decisions. I think, you know, first of all, if your paper gets rejected, don't take it personally. It is kind of a bummer if it gets rejected without a review and maybe you just didn't go to the right journal. But very few papers get accepted at especially top tier journals. And nothing gets accepted without revisions. Hardly anything. I've had like one paper accepted without a revision, and it wasn't in a top journal. It was in a really very specialized journal. And I kind of wondered how closely they read it. It was it was a well done paper, but it was, it wasn't perfect. Again, revisions are going to be standardized. And then when you do revise, I think, put the comments away for a day or two and then like really think about how you're going to tackle it. And think of it as an opportunity to make your paper better. I have to say that even if it's painful, like that process makes your work better, I think, in every case. And if the reviewers and editors are confused, there's probably some confusion there that you can sort out. And again, I think going through the comments with your co-authors and then responding, I will say, if you can really make that response really clear, like this is the line it was, and here's the line in the new paper, and track changes, whatever you need to do to make it really simple for the editor, they will be very appreciative. And I think, frankly, it isn't a lot of work as you revise. And if you disagree with something, I think it's okay to disagree respectfully and offer a reference potentially, like, we disagree respectfully with this reviewer, and here's why. And I think, again, sometimes it means reaching out to the editor and asking how to approach that. I don't want to say too much about preprints. These became really a big thing in infectious disease during the pandemic. They're here to stay. Again, I think it's very uncertain how much benefit these bring. I think they bring confusion sometimes, but they're here. And the two big ones that you're going to see are bioRxiv and medRxiv, and I'm just going to leave it at that. I'm also going to quickly talk about social media. I think social media is great. It's a great way to sort of keep up on research, new publications. Infectious disease, there's a lot that you'll see on Twitter. Now, you could also spend your entire day on Twitter and never get your work done, which is not good. But it's also a good way to bring attention to your work. Scientific meetings often have hashtags. There are like these tweet ups that I see, at ID Week and stuff, and people are very, very excited about that. So, it's a nice way to actually build a community outside of your institution. It's also a good way to recruit for clinical trials. You can crowdsource a lot of things through social media. Downside, there's time, there's trolls, misinformation, and I will just leave you with one comment, which is the crowded elevator rule. Like, if you wouldn't say it on a crowded elevator, you certainly should not say it on social media. So just, again, being careful. I myself am active on Twitter, but I'm very careful about what I post. I try to always have positive messages. I don't get political on Twitter. It's been helpful to me. It's brought attention to work that I feel strongly about. I've met some people that I don't think I even know them in real life, but I feel like they're my friends. So I think the social media can be really a good thing. And this is sort of recent numbers, and you can see here that Twitter, it's about 23% of adults who have ever used it. I think within academic infectious disease, it's probably that number, maybe higher. But again, that is probably the place you're more likely to have your academic work highlighted. And I know there've been all kinds of things that happened on Twitter in the last year, but it remains a good place to share stuff. And just some final thoughts, what we do in clinical care and ID, it's often not based on randomized trials. Like, every day I make decisions clinically that I am guessing. And so there is room for stuff like that to be published. If you look at the things I've published, it's all descriptive. I am not a trialist, although I handle trials as an editor. I have written lots and lots of descriptive papers, some that have been highly cited, some that have been very impactful in terms of going on to inform the guidelines. For example, some of my work is on antibiotics at the end of life. And that was something that I just observed as a geriatrician and as an ID doctor. And, that work helped me end up writing part of the guideline. So I would say, don't get discouraged if you feel like, gee, my work is retrospective and descriptive and it's only from my center. Is a very important place to start. And in fact, those papers inform clinical trials. So don't ever feel like what you're doing is not important. As long as you feel it's important, continue with it and get it done and get it written and published. Proper planning and study design is the best way to prevent problems during writing. And again, as you get into more sophisticated prospective work, this is really an important skill. And as I said a couple of times, novelty and validity are most important for a top tier journal. And this is a book that I don't know the author, but because I've shared this, I've actually gotten sort of feedback that this is an author from Montana who's like probably pretty happy that I highlight her book. But it's just a small little book. I gave it to my son's engineering class in high school years ago for their writing. So it's something that can be used for lots of different levels. I use it, and again, the high school kids can use it. And if you're looking for a good resource, I think this is one. It's less than $20, I think, to purchase it. It's a soft book and you can get through it pretty quickly. And I'm just going to leave you with this message that thing you're writing, whatever it is, it's awesome. And I'm going to stop sharing and let's see, stop share. Yes. I'm sorry, I spoke very fast. I mentioned that I have to join the JAMA manuscript meeting, but I'm happy to take some questions. It looks like Andrew, is there a question?
Yeah, thanks so much. Could you talk a little bit about when you have the opportunity to suggest reviewers or exclude reviewers, how you make those decisions?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question, Andrew. It's so, suggesting reviewers, sometimes you can enter them into there's a spot during submission. Otherwise, put them in your cover letter and take that time to offer reviewers. Now, make sure the reviewers are arm's length. They can't be your collaborators, but you know, I often will have these behind the scene conversations with authors and say, do you have a suggestion for a good reviewer? And I'll take it. I'll be like, oh, okay. You know, a lot of times I know who those people are. If you want to exclude someone, you can also put that in the cover letter. I personally, if you tell me Dr. Jones should not review this paper because we have a conflict or we're competitors, or like, I don't really even care personally what the reason is. I'm not going to have that person review. I don't know that that's the case 100% of the time with editors, but it should be. You know, now if you say, you know, these 20 people can't review, then it's going to raise questions. But, you know, there are people in small fields where they have been, you know, sort of unfairly criticized, let's say. And I think it's okay to say that. Okay. Dan?
Yes, thank you. The question I had was on artificial intelligence and
Yes.
this idea of enhanced writing, where all the people that you see on the screen here likely do it the old-fashioned way, which is to think of ideas themselves, and we are writing, writing our own papers. But we are also competing for grants against individuals that may not have that same approach, that normal approach. So I was just wondering how your journal and other journals had started trying to screen for either what we'd call enhanced writing or
Yes.
the ChatGPT effect.
Yeah. You know, I don't know if you guys can see this or not. Probably not. My son sent me this thing today. He's a consultant with PricewaterhouseCoopers. And he said, one of my projects is using AI generated art. Here's the girl with the pearl earring by Vermeer in Van Gogh style. And then he did it in Picasso. And I was like, can you do our dog with like the dog with the pearl earring? But it's amazing, right? What you can do. ChatGPT cannot be an author. And when I'm done today, I'm going to send you an editorial from JAMA that sort of responded to this, because it's like all of a sudden it's on everyone's mind. If you use it to help your writing, you should declare that, is what I would say. But we're trying to figure out how to deal with that. I think it may be useful for people who English is not their first language. I don't think ChatGPT writes papers the way that you and I would probably write a paper. So that is something, though, that is like the question of the day, right? You know, so yeah, if you're going to use it, just say you've used it. Okay.
Are there any other additional questions from the group, since Dr. Milani has another meeting to get to? And while you guys are thinking, I have to say one of our fellows actually used AI to write a poem about Carius, which is, you know, much beloved by some and much hated by others, in Dr. Seuss style, and that still gives me a chuckle sometimes.
That is hilarious. I would love to see that.
It's actually pretty good. There were some things that weren't quite right, but it was actually pretty good.
Yeah, wonderful. Oh, this is great. And thank you for people who sent me notes here, Anna. Yeah, so lots of, I wish I could stay and chat with everyone, but I'm going to run actually so I can present a paper quickly. And I will share my slides and I will share that ChatGPT piece as well.
All right, thank you.
Thanks so much.
for
Best
joining us.
wishes. Reach out anytime if you have questions about publishing in JAMA.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much. I think we're done, Kelly.
Yeah.
Let's do that because I wanted to raise an issue that I
Oh.
wanted to get people's input on.
We can do it in the next, in 2 weeks, Anna, if you want.
Okay, it's something that Preeti has referred to that I struggle with a lot, with what to do when you have unexpected results, whether positive or negative.
Yeah,
Why is it if they're negative, we react one way, and if they're positive, we react differently? I'd
Well,
like to
that-
talk about that.
that's a
That would be-
philosophical question. I like that.
That would have been a great question for her, though, to see what she
Right.
would have said. Maybe you
Right.
can shoot that to her. I wonder, Kelly, can we shoot her that question and see
Well,
what
I'd,
she?
I'd like to talk to you guys about it, because maybe we should write something about this issue.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
So let's
Oh,
talk about
yeah.
it first. I mean,
Question, can we add that question to our discussion in 2 weeks? Because I think we have someone to do a what you call it, career talk, and then we can use that as one of the other conversation points. I think that's really
Are
cool.
you guys having me do a career talk this year, or is that not planned?
What was the question?
Am I doing a career
This
talk?
year, probably not this year, but we haven't planned the second cycle.
I see. Just because I did one and I could talk about it, but this, I'm happy to talk about this whenever.
I know, I appreciate it. All right,
All right. Thank you so much, everybody.
Bye. Bye-bye.
In a couple
Thanks.
weeks. Bye.